I want to thank God for this opportunity to be with you all once again. And this is my third talk to in the chapel and then here as well. And I want to thank Dr. Tennant and Dr. Tom and others who have invited me to be here. Because coming to Asbury is like coming to our second home, and just enjoyed in the relationships and the people whom God has given us here, and it has been a truly blessed time for me. This morning, what I want to talk to you on the title, Changing Face, right? FACE and PHASE, Changing Face of Christianity, Missional Implications for the Global Church. So this is what would be our talk, and I hope to finish it within the time. And if we have some time, we will have question answers. I'd love to take questions. If not, I think we are going to have the refreshment break, and we can have some refreshing questions and answers during that time as well. Okay? It seems one time, Indian Maharaja. Okay, he's a great king. And this guy was going for hunting in the forest. And as he was going for hunting, he had taken his commander along. And he was known as a very sharp shooter. He's a very skilled hunter. So as he was going there, he saw suddenly in the middle of the forest, jungle, there was a clearing. And there was a series of practice boards. Okay, these are boards that are made, square boards made of wood, in which the archers at those times, they used to practice. Okay, you get the, here, in the shooting range, you get that, right? The bullseye and the circle and all those things. So the king stopped along with his commander. He saw the clearing, and he saw a series of these practice boards. And every one of the board he saw, there was an arrow that is stuck dead center bullseye. And the king got excited. He said, Ray, how did this guy is such a sharp shooter. I have never known this guy, so we have to find where he is. So sure enough, he was standing nearby, so he sent the commander to fetch him. And then the king asked him, I've never seen such a sharp shooter. All the practice boards I got, you have hit the bullseye. You need to tell me, who are you? Where did you study? Who is your guru from whom you learned this skill? And I want to recruit you to our army. And the guy looked at the emperor a little sheepishly, and then he said, Sir, it's not like what you think. What I usually do is, I first release the arrow and let it strike the board, and then I go and draw the circle around it. Sometimes when I think about communication, many times I found out, at least particularly in a Christian context, many times communication is like this. Like, I say something and somehow hope the Spirit of God would take it up and do something with that. It is true that the Spirit of God is there to help us, but also we need to be careful to learn, to strategic, to understand the context and the audience to whom we are communicating. So that is so critical. Sometimes in our training, even in seminary training, sometimes a lot of emphasis is given for how to study the word, which is rightly, it should be. At the same time, I believe there must also be enough emphasis on how do you study the world. Because you and I are called to communicate the word to the world, right? To make it understand it. So our communication is always receptor-oriented. Like not like the guy who was just learning to shoot. He said he was spraying bullets all over the place. And when his trainer was here, what are you doing? He said, I don't know, but it's going all right from this end, right? But that is not good communication, right? It must reach the target properly. And the key thing in that is, of course, there are many things. One is to understand the world, how the world is, and how the people are, and how the cultures are, and how they are shifting during now, and how we can communicate the gospel to them. That's why I have titled this talk as The Changing Face of Christianity, Missional Implications for the Global Church. Of course, Christianity has been changing, particularly in this 21st century. As we go on, I would show up some numbers to you. Just some of them are really staggering to see the shift that had happened, particularly from the end of 19th century, and then when we come now to the end of 20th century, the major shift that have happened in Christianity. And even up here as well, right? There has been a shift And I hear often Dr. Tennant talk about North America as the fastest growing mission field, right? Sometimes the struggle to communicate the gospel in meaningful ways for people to understand and to come to Jesus Christ is an ongoing thing. There's a good book by name Reimagining Evangelism. It's a book by Rick Richardson. In that book, he tells a story about a young youth pastor by name Daniel, who was serving in a big church. And the Lord told him that he felt he desired to reach out the younger generation of his time. And where do you find them most? You find them at Starbucks. So he decided to go and join Starbucks and take up a job there. And he went and took up a job at Starbucks. And he began to communicate the gospel to the people who were working with him. And when Daniel shared the gospel of Jesus with them, all 21 of his co-workers, Rick Richardson writes that there were two major surprises for Daniel. The first surprise was that all 21 of them were interested in God and spirituality. He thought somehow, they would resist spirituality. But almost every one of them were interested in spirituality or things related to spirituality. But the second major surprise was, even though every one of them were interested in spirituality, but none of them were interested in Christianity. And that made Daniel to really think about it. How do you communicate the gospel now? Because almost every one of them, in the experience of Daniel, had some kind of breach of trust with the church or with the faith or with some Christians over a period of time. As a result, many of them have closed their doors to Jesus. So he says that today, evangelism in America doesn't start at ground zero. It starts at -3 or -4. And in fact, Daniel has to pierce through the stereotypes that the people are having before he would even earn the right to share the gospel with them. So those are some of the major challenges, right? Some of the major issues. Very different from the first century when a band of people, like I spoke yesterday, who would come into the city of Antioch, right? And who would communicate the gospel. But now 20 centuries later, we have a big baggage, right? With both good, bad, and the ugly. And then we have to work through a lot of these things, even as we try to communicate the gospel. So things are getting more and more complex, even as the world is getting more and more complex. So it is going to become a greater challenge, whether you are going to be in America or in India or in any part of the world, it's going to be a greater challenge in the days to come. How do we understand the world and how do we communicate the gospel? So in order to understand it better, what I'm going to do this morning is, I have two major sections. The first is to understand how the Christian demographic itself is changing, okay? So that's the first part. And the second part is how the world around us is changing. Okay? So those are these two major themes I want to place before you. And finally, in the light of this, what are some of the key themes that we can think of? What are some of the key missiological implications when we look at these major changes that are happening around us? Okay, those are just few themes. I just want to throw it up before you. And there are many more things we can talk about. But for us today, this morning, I felt those three would be enough for us. Okay, the changing phase. I really like the picture. It kind of, moving along from one to another. But scholars are saying that literally the phase of Christianity is changing. Not only FACE, but also the PHASE. It's changing. Let's just look at a couple of things before we go into this. There is, as I told you earlier, a call to understand the world and understand the times that we live in. And of course, I want to show up a few scriptural passages. And based on that, just for us to see the importance of understanding the times that we live in. And this verse that David served God in his own generation, right? So there is an implication of understanding our own times, even as we serve God in our own generation. Each of us are raised by God for a particular purpose, in a particular place, for a particular time in human history. And so we need to recognize that and grasp that time in order to serve God faithfully. The second person is Esther. If you know this verse, and remember, Esther The Jews were about to be completely annihilated by the wicked Haman, and so Mordecai sends word to Esther that she must go and plead for the case of the Jews, and Esther would tell two excuses, right? One is that nobody can just walk into the king's court just like that. She must get the permission, or the king must first put the royal scepter in order to be accepted. And the second excuse is like, it has been 30 days, the king has, called me. In other words, maybe the king's love for me is waning. Right? Maybe I don't know, the king still loves me, and if I go and stand before him, I don't know, what his response would be. And then Mordecai reminds her, saying that was in verse 14, that how God has brought her and kept her as a queen for such a time as this. So he was trying to tell Esther, remember, the reason God has placed you as a queen in this so incredibly important position, because God has a purpose for such a time as this. You need to recognize, Esther, that you are called to play a role in such a time as this. The third is a favorite bunch of people. I love these people. They are called men of Issachar. We read about them in 1 Chronicles chapter 12 and verse 32. It says, men of Issachar who understood the times and knew what Israel should do. When you have time, please go back and read through Chronicles chapter 12. It's a series of people. It talks about their great strength, how they are mighty in valor, how they could do, battle, how they could wield the sword. All those things, it will be there. But in the middle of that, you see this little group of people saying that they understood the times and they knew what Israel should do. Of course, the final scripture passage is from our Lord Jesus himself. He is looking at the people, particularly the Pharisees and the other biblical scholars of the time, and he says, you know how to interpret the appearance of the earth and the sky. How is it that you don't know how to interpret this present time? It's a big challenge, right? Not only put to those people, but even to us in this 21st century. How is it that you don't know how to interpret this present time? So in other words, Jesus is calling us to understand and interpret this present time so that we would be able to serve him well in our own generation. Now, based on these scriptures, having made this point that we need to understand the times and interpret it rightly, I want to move on to show how the demographic shift is happening in contemporary times. Now, when in the 19th century, 1800 to say 1900, in the 19th century, that was often considered as the golden era of Protestant missions. That was the major thrust of missions, particularly the Western missions going into all over the world and bringing the gospel to the world. So we hear, the great Kenneth Luttrell, the great historian, would call that as the great century. He would call that as the great century. The other great historian who wrote the book on history of Christianity in Asia, Samuel Hugh Moffett, would call it the golden century of Protestant missions. Because this huge number of people have come to faith, and as you would see the number now, as I'm going to show you, so people were literally thinking that by the 20th century is going to be the great Christian century. Right? So that was the thinking as they were thinking about, because of a huge growth in Christianity around the world. Now, between 1800 and 1900, 100 years, the global Christian community came close to tripling its size. Imagine in 100 years, we have almost tripled in size. In 100 years. While the world population was increasing from 900 million to 1.62 billion, the number of Christians in the world rose from about 200 million in 1810 to 558 million in 1900. Measured in percentage growth, the world population grew 57% and Christianity grew at a remarkable 188%. So you see the amount of growth that had happened in the 19th century. A third, right, 1/3 of all the people in the world were Christians. 1/3 of all the people in the world were Christians at the time. So naturally, there was a kind of triumphalism, particularly from the Western missionaries and mission leaders, that it's just going to be a matter of time what is going to happen. The whole world is going to become Christian. That was so if you would read some of the literature, some of the great speeches of the mission leaders of the time, it was all about how this 20th century is going to be the Christian century, where the whole world is going to become Christian. Did it happen? What happened? Great enthusiasm and optimism by the end of 20th century, like the famous John Mott, the great leader of the evangelical student movement, would say, evangelization of the world in our own generation. It was not just mere a slogan. They all actually believed it's going to happen in their own generation because of the kind of growth that happened in the 19th century. And this respected historian, William Schaff, at the 1888 London Conference, he wrote like this: there are three epochs of missions in history: the apostolic, the medieval, and the modern. The result of the first was the conversion of the Roman Empire. The result of the second was a Christian Europe. And the result of the third will be the conversion of the whole world. Right? So these are not, just mission promotional guys somehow hoping this would happen, right? These are historians who are talking, who are giving those numbers. So the first epoch, we had the conversion of the Roman Empire. The second epoch, the conversion of Europe and becoming Christian Europe. And the third epoch is going to be in the modern era. There's going to be conversion of the whole world. That was their thinking. Farquhar is a famous missionary. I like him. He's a great scholar who had served in India. He actually wrote in his book that because of Christianity and modern education, it's going to usher in the collapse of Hinduism. Hinduism will collapse. At the end of his book, he says, because of modern education and Christianity. And remember, he was a great scholar on Hinduism. And at the same time, there was another scholar and a great missionary by name Samuel Zwimmer, who was working among the Muslim people, Muslim communities. And in his book, The Disintegration of Islam, he said that the Islamic world is going to collapse, and all of them are going to become Christian. Most of them will become Christians because 5 out of 6 of Muslims live under the British colonial empire. In other words, as the colonial empire goes out, he's thinking that, more and more because other people will come. And now at the end of 100 years, we are just wondering what had happened, right? He believed in modernity, and interestingly, modernity itself collapsed, right? In the 20th century or in the times that we live in. And Hinduism emerged as a vibrant force, not only within the country, but also it exported a particular form of Hinduism that would come here and radically shift American culture. It's a particular form of Hinduism that came from 60s and 70s. I remember that came out with New Age ideas and teachings and relativism and all kinds of things that would radically alter the cultural thinking of America itself. Interesting. And what happened to this? Interesting, because the sun would never set on British Empire. That was he was hoping, and as a result, many they would come to faith, but British Empire itself collapsed. And Islam is probably the fastest growing religion today. There was a time of great enthusiasm and hoping, and the 20th century would be a time when, world would become Christian. But what happened? What happened? There was some surprising shifts happen in the 20th century. This was by the great scholar Todd Johnson. He says, at first glance, now we are looking at the end of 1900 and 2000, okay? Now we are looking at the end of 20th century. At first glance, there has been little change in the status of global Christianity over the past 100 years, right? For the entire 100-year period, Christians have made up approximately 1/3 of the world's population. Remember I told you in 1900, there was 1 out of every 3 person in the world was a Christian, okay? Because Christianity tripled itself in the 19th century. But now in the 20th century, as we come, what had happened? We still remain the same, okay? At least we are holding fort in some sense. So we say we are still 1 out of 3 persons. But Todd Johnson says This marks dramatic changes in the geography of global Christianity. The number remains the same, but the shift is very different as you look deeper into this. What had happened, he says, 66% of all Christians lived in Europe in 1910. By 2010, only 26% live there. Fewer than 2% of all Christians lived in Africa in 1910, but now it has skyrocketed to almost 22% by 2010. Imagine the growth in Africa. The number of Christians increased from 10 million in 1900 to 360 million by 2000, according to Philip Jenkins. Then the overall number has remained, but there has been significant decline in some parts, and there has been significant increase in other parts of the world. So truly the face of Christianity is indeed changing. The global north, as defined as Europe and North America, contained over 80% of all Christians in 1910, falling to under 40% by 2010. This is a significant number, right? 80% lived in Europe and North America, and now only less than 40%. Almost half of the percentage has gone down. So Philip Jenkins says that by 2050, only about 1/5 of the world's 3 billion Christians will be non-Hispanic whites. Soon the phrase, a white Christian, may sound like a curious oxymoron. Now you understand the significance of the efforts that are being launched out by the church planting initiative at Asbury, precisely because of some of these numbers that are really staring at us and scaring us in some way. So Jenkins claims the era of Western Christianity has passed within our lifetimes, and the day of Southern Christianity is dawning. The fact of change itself is undeniable. It has happened and will continue to happen. Okay? So that was the central thesis of his book, The Next Christendom. Southern Christianity, he talks about the Christianity in Asia, Latin America, and in Africa, primarily. So now the question is, are we in an era of post-Christian West and post-Western Christianity? This is how we look at our time that we live in. Would we define ourselves? Is this a time of post-Christian West and post-Western Christianity? If that's the case, how would things look like? How are we going to go about? And it's going to call some radical shift in our thinking. Christianity, Christian missions cannot be operated in the olden colonial model of, missions is seen as a monocultural, monodirectional, right? Going from one place to another place, like often going from West to the non-Western world. So now it's going to be radically different. In fact, people or scholars are talking about missions as from everywhere to everywhere in this new era as things are emerging as we look at this picture. This is just a brief look at the numbers and seeing how things are changing rapidly, in the Christian world. And I want to move on quickly to the second part. I said of how do we understand the world as such it's changing. But, when we see some of the significant decline, I think that the Lord is also doing some remarkable things, and I think particularly through diaspora and migration, and some of the Christians coming in are really revitalizing even American Christianity today. It's very interesting to read some of the numbers that are emerging of how in traditional groups like IVCF and in some other places where you have a lot of American Christian young people. Today, the numbers are more about Chinese and Indian and Korean young people who are revitalizing some of these groups, and some of these groups are revitalizing the local church. So it's a very interesting thing that is happening. I would never believed, the decline, but, it is there in the numbers, right? Sometimes, we have to just see it, and we all know in some of the numbers from our own denomination or from some other denominations, some of the decline that has happened. But I had an interesting experience here a couple of years ago that really made me to think about the Christianity, or at least the status of Christianity in the U.S. I was here for the Alumni Council, as I introduced the other day, so I chair the International Alumni of Asbury, and so I'm part of the Alumni Board or Council. So I come here twice a year. And, it takes like, I'm on air for 2 full days, both ways, just on air for 2 full days. And I'm going to be here for a meeting for 1 day, okay? So I tell Tammy, like, Tammy, it's not a good, stewardship of my time and my energy to be on air for 2 full days and sit in the alumni council meeting for 1 day. So usually what I do is, as a preacher, I get invitations in the U.S., so I kind of take 2 weeks off from my work and come and do some preaching here so that, then I go back to the country and feeling, okay, I have invested something meaningful with the time that I've put in here. So there was a time I was flying out from here to Portland to speak in an Indian church, and it was a long flight. By that time, I was already exhausted, having done some work here. And I remember I went to Chicago and got a plane from Chicago to Portland, and it was not very crowded, and where we were sitting, the row that I was sitting, I was in the aisle, and there was a space in between, and then there was a lady, an American lady, sitting by the window. And I was so tired, I think I just dozed off, but I could hear maybe in my subconscious mind, as if somebody is, kind of sniffing, that sound. In my subconscious mind, I was thinking, I think this lady has got a cold, okay, and I have some more meetings to do, and I hope I don't get a cold from her, okay? This is how my subconscious mind was thinking. Shame on me, but that's how I was thinking. But as after halfway through, I kind of opened up, and that lady began to talk with me. She was like downing so many shots from the steward who were bringing in. And we just began to chat up, and she asked me, who am I and why am I here? So I, as an evangelist, kind of approach different people in different ways. So at that time, I have not been at SIAX. So as I told you, we also work among the HIV people and marginalized children in India. So she asked me, like, why are you here? So where do you live? I said, I live in India, but I studied here. I lived in here for 6 years. I have a PhD, but now I went back to India. And suddenly her eyes widened, and she said, like, why? Like, why would you go back to India with a PhD, having gotten a PhD from US? I said, it's because of Jesus. She couldn't place it. So then she asked me, what do you do? I said, well, I work with the HIV people. And then again her eyes went wide and said, why would you do that? I said, it's because of Jesus. And so then slowly we began to talk, and then I said, do you know Jesus was the greatest revolutionary in the world? She said, tell me more. And I began to say how Jesus was, in the first century set up, how he approached women, and, some of his strategies, how the way he handled lepers. And so I was talking, I think, from in Matthew chapter 8. In Matthew chapter 8, we see that, there is these 2 stories are put together. One is Jesus healing the leper, and the next story is Jesus healing the centurion servant. Remember that centurion would ask Jesus, and Jesus would say, okay, let's go to your home. And centurion would say, please don't come to our home. I'm not worthy to have you in my home. Just say the word, and my servant will be healed. And Jesus would just say the word, and the servant will be healed. But just before that, the previous passage was what? It is about the healing of the leper. And the leper comes before him and said, Jesus, I know you are able to heal me. Please heal me. And what did Jesus do? He would reach out his hand and touch him and heal him. So I told her, Jesus need not touch that guy, because if he could send a word to somebody, being far away and heal, he could just put a word to this leper and that guy could get healed. But why would Jesus touch him? So it's more than mere healing. He was making a statement. He was communicating that God in human form has come in so that he had embraced the unlovable. He would touch the so-called untouchable, and he would embrace the unembraceable. Now, that's my point as I began to share with her on this, and as I kept sharing, her eyes began to get wider and wider. And of course, she was going through a lot of issues and problems. She just shared with me, and then finally, she said, very interesting, to cut the story short, she said, you know what? I have a principle. This is how she put it. I have a principle. If 3 unrelated people talk about the same thing over a short period of time, then whoever who is up there, that's a definition of God, okay? Whoever who is up there, he is trying to get some through to me. And you know what? You are the third person who told about Jesus to me this week. So I'm going to do about that something about it. But the tragic part was, as we were about to get down, and she had more questions about, the Bible, New Testament, Old Testament, all those things. But then towards the end, she looked at me and asked, I would never forget, and I really felt bad. She said, can you tell me where I can find or buy a Bible in Portland? Can I get it in Barnes and Noble? I would never, it just blew my mind up, because I would never imagine that in America somebody is going to ask me, an Indian, where can I find a Bible here? I'm just saying, that is, it kind of opened up my eye a little bit to what is happening here in some parts. I know, there is the Bible Belt and, all kinds of things. But some parts, again, it looks like this. And my biggest disappointment was, I just had a Bible in my hand luggage. I should have taken and given it to her. I just missed it. Okay. So changing face of Christianity, we just looked at briefly the changing Christian demographic, what's going on. But I want to quickly look at a little bit of how the world is changing. Okay, a little bit of how the world is changing. This is part of a lecture also I give on how India itself is changing, and in some microcosmic way that India kind of could be representative of the whole world. Some of the issues that are happening are actually happening because of the global influence as well. So I put, there are the 5 important themes how this era is defined at this particular juncture, okay, as we live in. And the first one, I call it as an era of local complex connectivity, right? There is a dialectic interdependence between the global and the local going on, so that the global influences the local and the local influences the global, right? And as a result, it is becoming very complex. The connectivity is becoming very complex because of this. Let me give you another quick example. This girl who came with Asbury Seminary to my seminary in Bangalore at SAIGS 2 years ago. Every year, or at least once in 2 years, we host a team of students from Asbury, and this January we hosted 20 of them. They sat in our class, Global Urban Church Planting, and together with my students. So 2 years ago, another group had come and we had hosted, and I gave a brief lecture on urban anthropology as one who teaches anthropology. So I just gave a brief, a lecture on urban anthropology and globalization, and I showed them a video. In India, you won't believe, in India, in the last 15 years, 250,000 farmers have committed suicide. Just try to get a hold of that. 250,000 farmers have committed suicide in India in the last 15 years. They call this as the largest wave of human suicide in human history. Very tragic. There are many reasons for that. Well, of course, I briefly talked about it, and then I showed them a video. I think you could see that video. It's about many reasons. One of the reasons because of a pharmaceutical company and the price they fix for the fertilizers and how that is affecting the farmer, okay? I won't mention the name of the pharmaceutical company, but you could go into YouTube and you can, I still hope the video is still the short video, 30 minutes. It's called 100% Cotton Made in India, okay? 100% Cotton Made in India. So the lecture was over, the video was done, we had some discussion, was over, and I was standing outside the classroom talking with other students, and this girl, I could see she was in some consternation. She wanted to come and talk with me. And as I began to talk, I came to know that she's an Excel student and working in a large city in the US and working in a large corporation here. And to her great bafflement, that day she realized that the company for which she is working is putting all her retirement benefits into the stocks of this very pharmaceutical company that is responsible for, in some sense, the death of so many farmers in India. She could not believe that what she is doing from faraway place in this place is affecting some farmer somewhere in one corner in India. Now, welcome to the world of local, complex connectivity. That's the kind of world. She kept asking, tell me, what should I do? And honestly, I felt asking the same question, because there are no easy answers, right? There are no neat answers because of the complexity that we see in the world currently. 2 years ago, I think the Intel put out this chart. I really like this chart. It said, like, what happens in one internet minute? Okay, what happens in one internet minute? And I called it information upload, download, and overload. And that's what I guess it's happening today. And there are a lot of stuff you could see. But here you look at it in YouTube. In 1 minute, all over the world, 1.3 million videos are being watched. Google, 2 million search queries. Can you imagine the knowledge explosion? In 1 minute, 2 million search queries are being put into Google. So I was telling, even yesterday or day before, I think Dr. Tennant showed the seminary, where he's teaching in North India, but if you would see our seminaries, Asbury also has an MOU with SciEx as well in Bangalore. It's like different world. Like here you see guys just like here sitting with all of them, 20 of them means 20 of them with a laptop, and that's the kind of seminary in Bangalore we have. Now, whether it's good or bad, it's different, but it's getting the work difficult for a professor, because all you have to do is you talk about, right, you say a word, you tell an author, and before you would know that guy is actually having the book, before him. So you have to be, correct, you have to be prompt, and, you would easily be, found out if you are not on your game. So Google, imagine that, and all this Facebook and all this, But one thing, what I would like to show here is the email, right? 204 million emails are being sent every 1 minute around the world. 204 million emails are being sent. Of course, it's going to get more worse, and we are in 2015, and actually these guys had said in 2015 it would take 5 years to view all the videos crossing IP networks each second. Each second, all the videos that are passing through all IP networks, you want to take them out and you want to view them, it's going to take 5 years for us. That's the world that we are living in. Very different challenges, but also great opportunities that we are living. So the world is changing fast here or in other parts of the world. You need to come to a place like Bangalore and Delhi and to see, like I often say, a young man in Bangalore probably is more closer culturally to a young man in Boston than his own father in Bangalore. That's the kind of globalized how the next generation are becoming. So it's a challenge. And of course, this is the largest temple in US. And the challenge is, because of globalization and travel, there is migration and diaspora, and all those things are happening. So it's a challenge because of new religion is going to come in here, right? So that is a challenge you must be aware of. But there is also an opportunity. God is bringing people to your doorsteps as well to communicate the good news of the gospel. And so these are some of the interesting challenges and opportunities that are developing. Okay? Now, I like this picture because all you have to put is just a, bindi and a earring and a scarf, and suddenly she becomes an Indian. The second thing, I talk about the major theme. First is the globalization, connectivity. Second major theme is an era of heightened cultural sensitivity. You see it all over the flashpoints, the conflict that are happening, whether in India or even across the world, we see a heightened cultural sensitivity. People are, there are two forces that are happening simultaneously, we usually call it. And this is one of my favorite pictures, what globalization is doing to the world. And but there are two forces which we say. One is the homogenization. Okay, there are some scholars say invariably everybody is becoming Western in the world currently. And then there are other scholars who are also seriously arguing that the tribalization, no, the globalization is actually causing people to split into more tribal, become more culturally sensitive of their roots. And a lot of the fight that are going on is because of that. Like people like, I think, Benjamin Barber, who wrote Jihad versus McWorld, or, like Samuel Huntington, History of Civilization, I think, Brief History of Civilization, or something like that. So where, he talks about the conflict that are happening across the lines along civilization and religion. So those are some of the scholars who are talking on these lines. And so, but I think that probably it is both. In a remarkable way, globalization is bringing both a homogenization as well as a tribalization as well. And this also has some major implication for the gospel, how we are going to communicate Christ in this world. In some places, what does it mean? What does that mean? In some place, Christianity as a Western, if it's perceived as a Western religion, will be seen as good, right? For some community who aspire to be Western, who aspire to be homogenized, according to the Western ways of living. For them, some of them, if they would see Christianity as a Western religion, could be a thing to be desired. But then if somebody falls on these lines, okay, of tribalization, who could see that as an imposition upon their cultural imposition, they may want to go back into a form of an indigenous way of living, indigenous faith, and the approach to them has to be very different. So that's why very important in our missions, we need to remember that one size don't fit at all for everybody. Because sometimes we have this idea, because we often get this idea coming out from West, suddenly somebody picks up this one grand idea and then he says, oh, this is the one that's going to unlock all the major missiological problems around the world. And a big hype is created around it. But that's not how it is when you look at the context. Each context are different and we need to be aware of that. Number 3, we also see that this as an era of exciting gospel receptivity. Okay? It's an era of exciting gospel receptivity. This happened in Punjab, and when I went to speak here, they called it Mela, and we heard that there was some threat from the opponents of the gospel, and these guys went to the police. At that time, they refused to act on it, but then immediately the next day I was told that there was some issue, a bomb blast or something happening nearby Delhi. So the next day the police had come, and so we had with police protection, that day I had preached in this place. Now, interestingly, at least in India, there are major movements that are happening, what we call as the Christward movements. People who are coming to faith, coming towards Christ. They may not coming to the church as we know of, or even to the Christianity as we know of, but they are moving towards Christ. It's just like a very complex, it's going to take a whole, at least 1 or 2 hours to explain everything about it. But things are happening, interestingly, and at SciEx I've been asked to lead a major research project we are working on, studying movements, people coming to Christ from various faith communities, and it's really exciting to see what the Lord is doing. But it is in a very different way, and it's going to really challenge and stretch our thinking, some of the new expressions of faith that are emerging. And as a result, a lot of conflict between established churches and some of these emerging churches. So that is also happening, and we are trying to negotiate them and try to bring them all together under one platform. It's an era of exciting receptivity. Of course, we see this religious heart cry of people, the longing within them to know Christ or to know the real God. And this is a moving picture. I somehow, just to go near the ear and to pour out your burden, hoping that the gods would hear them. And this is the heart cry of people. And some of the movements come up with various names like Yeshu Bhaktas, Christ Bhaktas, followers of Isa, and the Yesu Satsangis. These are all among various different faith communities, but they are coming, and due to various reasons, they would not even take the name Christian, because for some of them, that is a particular baggage, the term, so they are trying to use some of the other terms. So whether it's right or wrong, that's the debate. That is, in fact, you won't believe, completely that is divided today's American missions. Just how do you do, whether you say yes to insider movement or not, whether you are going to embrace these guys or not, is completely divided. I've seen writing so bad, attacking each other, and I have been very pained to read them. So that's why last year, Dr. Tennant and I, we were in the conference at Turkey for this, where we were bringing together these guys, and they were talking on these issues of how can we come together as the followers of Christ and serve unitedly. I won't go into these details, it's going to take a little longer time, but these are some of the key features of what's happening with these movements that may be a little different from what has happened before, but these are some of the key features. And one of the things that I have always emphasized on the revolutionary understanding versus revolutionary acceptance, because sometimes we want people to accept it just like that, right? But as pastors, right, the difficulty of working and journeying along with people, helping them to understand. So that's the same thing. Sometimes we have our like a orthodoxy, and then we just set a stand and say, today this guy is coming, and tomorrow he must prescribe to the historic orthodoxy, just like as I have believed. It won't happen. And that's why we need to work with them. Remember the story, I have a great devotion. I love the devotion when we study John 4, Jesus talking with the Samaritan woman. Remember, the first perception of the woman of Jesus was what? Here is, when she saw him first, she would have thought, here is a male, right? Here is a Jew, and then is a rabbi. He said a rabbi. And then as he began to talk, right, it was more of a evolutionary. And as she began to talk with Jesus, she said, are you greater than our forefather Jacob? As Jesus began to engage with her, soon enough, right, she began to get to know him a little bit more. Then she said, I see you are a prophet. And then as time goes on, as he begins to talk, he said, could this be the Messiah? And then we see how did the story end. When all the people went to Jesus and he stayed with them for 2 days, and then the story ends that the people they looked at this lady and said, we no longer believe because you have told, but we ourselves have seen and heard from him, and he is the, do you know what did they say? He is the Savior of the whole world. Interesting how they have journeyed, how they have moved along in their understanding. And it's so important because sometimes if we try to force things on us, wanting to be that revolutionary acceptance, things can backfire, and don't have time to tell you some of the incidents based on this. Of course, even yesterday I spoke a little bit about it. On one hand, there is a receptivity, and then there is also an organized religious animosity, often organized for other political and cultural reasons as well, and that is all over the place. I don't even have to explain this to you. That is one of the key markers of what's happened. I think some numbers people are putting up by saying, like in 20th century, we had more martyrs together than all the 19th centuries combined. And so we know of the persecution and things that have been going around in different parts of the world. And the last one is, as we see this world, there is a widening economic disparity, both at the global level and even at India. In 1991, India liberalized its economy, and in 2011, there was a major article written by India's economist, Nobel laureate Amartya Sen, and in a magazine, and this was the front page in that magazine of, can you see the Domino's pizza, right? And here is this little guy who had a wash in one of the pipes, in the streets, and looking longingly inside. That was the picture put out. And do you know what this picture is? This is world's costliest home, built in Mumbai. Can you guess how much it cost for this guy to build this home? $2 billion. $2 billion. One of India's richest business tycoon, Mukesh Ambani. Now, in the same Mumbai has also got Asia's largest slum. And that's the irony. You could see the rich and the poor so close in India and of course in other parts. So this is what this Amartya Sen had said. There is probably no other example in the history of world development of an economy growing so fast for so long with such limited results in terms of broad-based social progress. He said in the last 20 years, Indian economy grows so well. From 1991, he was saying, to 2011, it grew so well, and the GDP grew enormously, but what had happened? But there was such a limited results in terms of broad-based social progress, right? The welfare that would, be spread out to all sections had not happened. This thing is really getting, that's why I told you, right? In the last 15 years, we have had 250,000 farmers committing suicide in India. So these are the challenges as we look at a world that is completely, right, getting more complex. And in some sense, these problems have been always there, right? The economy inequality and all. But it gets some fresh expressions during every new era. And so as the church, we are called to stand in the gap, I believe, and ask this question, what should we do in such a time as this? How do we serve in such a time as this? Very, very critical. I want to place before you 3 key themes, as I told you, about how do we serve in such a time as this, and some of the missiological implication that arises out of these, all the changes that are happening around in the world. The first one, what I call is the posture. What kind of posture do we take in missions in this era? And I always like this phrase by David Bosch. He says, it's a posture of humble boldness and bold humility. Because historically, sometimes the non-Christian people have rightly accused us that, we have sometimes come across as arrogant, know-all, trying to impose ourselves in some situation. And, I have had so many illustrations or incidents, both in book or, in a personal experience of people telling us. So we need to have that humility, but sometimes humility could be equated with being cowardly, right? So that's where the danger. We should not mistake boldness as arrogance and humility as cowardice. Sometimes we can do that. But we, with all humility, knowing we are who we are by the grace of God, we have been washed by the blood of Jesus and redeemed by the Lamb, but we must also have the boldness to proclaim Jesus as the Lord. And knowing that there is going to be opposition, knowing that, martyrdom, even martyrdom is at hand, because, the word witness is there for 29 times we read the term witness in the book of Acts, and it comes from the root word, Greek martyria, from which we get the English word martyr. So it's an attitude of, humble boldness and bold humility. And I put John 4:7 here. That was Jesus. Jesus engaging with the Samaritan, and that to a Samaritan woman, and that to openly, that is one of boldness. But when Jesus looked at her, and what did he ask? He said, "Can you give me water?" Now that's humility. Identifying in the common humanity of others, knowing that I too have a need. As the famous, a Sri Lankan bishop, D.T. Niles would say, evangelism is one beggar telling another beggar where to find food. So that is that humility, but at the same time, there is the boldness to say that Jesus is Lord. And one of the great statements I love about that boldness about Jesus is E. Stanley Jones. My favorite statement is he says, "I am fixed on Jesus and flexible on everything else." Right? I'm fixed on Jesus and I'm flexible on everything else. In the days of pluralism, in the days of relativism, in the days of, kind of political correctness, it's going to take a lot for us to even to say that Jesus is Lord. But we are fixed on Jesus. We must be people of humble boldness and bold humility. I want to move on. Number 2, the power. In this changing scenario, the changing phase of Christianity and the world that we see around, the second major issue that will be played out is a fresh new understanding of power. That's why the first day I preached on, remember in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and 7, Paul said that we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is not from us, but from God. In fact, unfortunately, sometimes there are Christian workers who would invert it, and in fact, they want to show that this all-surpassing power is not from God, but from us. Right? There are people who tend to project like that. But we know that the power comes from God, and then, maybe, we don't know, ministry might be done more in the margins. right? Ministry could be done more in the margins. That's why I think a lot of lessons could be learned. The North American Christianity could learn a lot of lessons from Southern Christianity. How it is to serve in the margins. How do you serve in the matrix? How did you ministry in the matrix of marginalization? There's a lot of stuff the Southern Christianity can teach us. Because our conception of power, you notice I put this verse here deliberately, Acts 1:6. Remember the disciples, Jesus talked about the kingdom of God in Acts 1:3. And then the people and the disciples would come and they asked this question. What did they say? Are you going to restore the kingdom to Israel now? He was talking about the kingdom of God, right? They were thinking about the kingdom of Israel. So I suspect there is some sort of a power play underneath, right? Even when he was alive, these disciples had a lot of power play, right? One wanted to sit on the right hand, the other wanted to sit on the left hand. So there was a power play. I used to think, just in an imaginary scenario that probably each of them would be thinking, now Jesus had defeated the final foe, which is death itself. Now he is going to drive out the Romans. He's going to set up the Davidic golden rule as Jerusalem as the headquarters, right? So that probably, so now who is going to get what portfolio in the kingdom, in the cabinet that Jesus is going to set up? Probably Peter would have thought, I'm the chief guy and I would be the number one guy. So I could be the prime minister of the cabinet that Jesus is setting up. Our Indian context, prime minister is the number one guy. I thought John is the, kind of number two, I felt like homely guy who took Jesus' mother in his home, so he could be like a good fit to be the home minister in the cabinet that Jesus was setting up. Matthew was the tax collector who handled finance, so he would have probably fancied himself to be the, finance minister in the kingdom that Jesus is going to set up. Simon the Zealot was an armed revolutionary before he became a follower of Jesus, so he could have thought probably I would be a good fit to be the defense minister. Thomas was a guy who was always seeking evidence, so I thought he could be a good fit to be the minister for crime and justice, right? Andrew was the guy who brought the little boy with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, so I thought maybe he could be a good fit to be the minister for food and civil supplies. And, there are endless possibilities, right, you can think on. But I suspect there is a power play there when they said, are you going to set up the kingdom now? Restore the kingdom to Israel now? What did Jesus answer? He precisely answered the issue of power. He said that when the Spirit of God comes upon you, you will receive power. But this is a power of a different kind and a power for a different purpose. That you will be my witnesses, my representatives, my ambassadors in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. So this power, how do we have this power from God and to live often sometimes in a human powerless situation, but continue to have that power of God and to serve God faithfully? Now that is something we need to learn anew, probably in this 21st century as things are changing, as things are shaping as the way they are. The issue of power, we can talk more on that, but I'm going to be done and just go to the final one. The third P I want to talk on is partnership, right? Partnership. Recently at the, last year at June, at the American Society of Missiology conference in Minnesota, I presented a paper on partnership, almost 30-page long, kind of critiquing both sides of the Indian and the American Christian missional partnership. But partnership is so important today because I firmly believe it's going to take the global church to reach the global world. There is no other option. And it's going to take a lot of humility and interdependence to learn from one another. It's very important. Both sides. So that's why it's going to be very critical. Sometimes I often when I come, some way, a little critique where, when I come here, people tell, Prabhu, tell your story. A lot of times. And I always resist that in one way because just a story of me would not make sense unless it is put within the larger story of God's story. And sometimes when I come here and tell a story, I could be turned into a trophy, right, for the American trophy syndrome of, see, this is what we have produced. But I always make it a point, even when I share my testimony, it's put within the larger story of God's story, because that's how it will make sense. And it is very important to bring people from other parts of the world and ask, brother, do you have a word from the Lord for our church? Just like, we would invite us and say, do you have a word from the Lord for our church? And I think that's how true partnership can happen, when the true test is of reciprocity. When we understand we need each other, because it's going to take the global church to reach the globalized, increasingly globalized world today. For that, we need to come together. With God's strength, we need to hold our hands together and work together. I want to close with this true story. Many years ago, in a little tribal village in Africa, a young girl, a little child went missing. And it was in the heart of the African jungle with this high-grown grass, where it's so difficult to search. So people went all over the place trying to search for the little girl, and they couldn't find the girl. They were so disappointed. They all came back, trickled back one by one. And they went back to bed and hoping tomorrow morning, early morning, at the fresh crack of dawn, they would go out and begin the search again. The next morning, at the crack of dawn, everybody was up in the village trying to go out and search for the little girl. But before they would go out, the elder of the village said, hey, wait a minute. Before we would go out, we were just going in all directions. What we are going to do now is, we are going to stand in a long straight line, and we are going to hold our hands together. We are going to hold our hands together, and let's comb through these tall grass, so that we would not be, miss the little girl if the girl is, hidden somewhere in the grass. So they all formed this long line, and they held their hands together, and they began to walk into this tall grass, just combing through this grass. And soon enough, they found the little girl. They found the little girl. But unfortunately, because she was exposed to the elements overnight, she had died. So the mother of the little girl took the limp body of the girl, and she placed it on her laps, and she was weeping profusely. And as she was crying loudly, she kept repeating these words. She kept repeating these words. She said, if only we had held our hands together earlier, my girl would not have died. If only we have held our hands together earlier. If only. If only. If only. May our Lord bless you all. Thank you.